starting again.
Okay. Right, so one thing Mary Walters did, I'll just say that this bit again, is she got these children to lie down and drew their shapes, and then for them to bring in photographs that they could put on, or photographs of, or she would photograph images, or they'd draw, and then they spoke about their art. So it wasn't all history. It wasn't sticking a microphone under a kid and saying, oh, how do you cope with keeping your religion or anything like that, because most of them put something religious on this, and then they spoke about it absolutely with great articulation. It was really extraordinary. So that was a fantastic project. The reminiscences were published in a book called The Peoples of Edinburgh, but that led to a huge number of other projects. We did one called The Hopes and Dreams of Refugees, because the refugee group that I worked with wanted to do another exhibition, so they did one in the Museum of Edinburgh. There was Balti Tasverin, which means Talking Pictures, which was a South Asian women's group and young girls, and all their photographs of themselves, which was in about 1998. So a lot of these projects carried on really on the strength of the Peoples of Edinburgh exhibition. Following on from that, we at the museum have been building up a large amount of oral history. I think there's about, well, at that point there was about 400 interviews, and it was really quite important to get these interviews out in some way and out into the public. And I've been asked to write a chapter for a book on living in one room in towns and cities, for a book that was published by the National Museum and accompanied an exhibition there of living in, well, the Scottish Home it was called. And it just going through, because not only did we have our extracts, but we had all the oral history archive of Leith Lives, which was a very long project that ran in Leith, so we had all those transcripts. We also had the Old Town archive, so these were all done under Manpower Services Commission projects in the 1980s. So I could draw on that to extract material and then write to everybody about whether we could use it to fill gaps. I kept calling the Reminiscence group back, and they were very keen. And why I work with women so much is because they were far easier to tell you stuff than men, particularly aspects of hidden history. And it was a sheer tribute. We wanted this book, She Was I Working, to be a tribute to the the sheer strength of women in the past to bring up their families through really impossible odds. You know, it was from about 1900 to 1960 the book set, but the period between the wars was just absolutely terrible. And we collected material from women, but also from men, talking about their mothers and their grannies as well. And those testimonies were very, very powerful, as well as the women's testimony. This book has sold 28,000 copies. It's extraordinary how I think the publisher that we have is very good at marketing, because I think a lot of them go to Canada and Australia and New Zealand, and people wanting to know how their grannies lived, things like that. But in this book we talked about, you know, girls getting periods, we've talked about domestic abuse, we've talked about what young women entering marriage not having a clue about what sex was about. You know, that's all in there. And that's, you know, just stuff that was not previously spoken about in anyway. I mean, what happened when we got a period and you lived in a one room? And I suppose as I say, my interest in women was because the reminiscence groups that we worked with was largely women. There were a few men in them, so I got so used to working with women and telling their stories. Somebody said a very interesting thing to me once about the people's story. They said, "Oh, this is far more based around women than men." And I went round and I counted because it wasn't particularly intentional, but there was an equal number of stories about men and women, but it just shows what people are used to. The fact that it's equal means it appeared to be far stronger for women than for men.
So, what about the fact that you decided to continue your interest in women's history even later than that, and even have continued into retirement? What accounts for that?
Well, definitely a passion about there not being enough statues. I think that was that was the driving thing, and I suppose just my sheer love of working with a community to put on a display. I think, that's just doing that, having that teamwork is just something that's so exciting.
So which project did you become involved in?
Oh, that was called Women on the Platform.
And what group was that with?
And that was the DRBs, and that resulted in a 3-month exhibition at the Museum of Edinburgh, and it is now travelling.
Exactly.
I would like to say something about the Women's Trail, if that's okay.
Yes, please do. Please.
When I was asked to write some items for the biography of Scottish women, I made the point that, well, when you have a group of fishwives or a group of women from the Scottish Cooperative Women's Guild, then they are very much a group. It's not to one, if you like, one person. Like you might get one person who is a great novelist, or one person who was, a great doctor or a great lawyer. And for that, I actually wrote about, say, the Scottish Cooperative Women's Guild wrote about 3 women. And I was thinking about this, that I think it's quite easy to think about, oh yes, well, so-and-so lived here or had something to do with that place. But I think we ought to have, as part of the women's group, places where communities were active. In the 1960s, there was probably the most active women's political campaign ever. And that was about the closing of the wash houses. And they stormed the city chambers at that time, because the wash houses were set up in the late 1890s. And before then, women were trying to do a family wash for a huge family in cold water with a washing, clothes, which were probably extremely dirty. And what the wash house did was it took that all out of the house. It provided the facilities to wash and dry the clothes, but on top of that, it meant there was a place where women could meet and have a blether. So they could have a blether while they were doing their chores. And the so-called progressive administration in the 1960s wanted to close them, and did close them, so it didn't make any difference that they campaigned. So the city chambers for the closure of the wash houses, Newhaven Fish Market, as a place where fishwives, both from Newhaven but also from Musselburgh, came in and collected their fish and went out and put them in creels with bands around their head and carried them around the streets of Edinburgh. And the last fishwife was Esther Liston, and she's been commemorated because she was the last fishwife, and she's got her name in the biography of Scottish women. But there were loads of other fishwives, it's just that she was the last one, so I think we need one there. I think we need one on the Quaker Meeting House because of to pay tribute to the Quakers. If it hadn't been for the Quaker movement, we wouldn't have had Eliza Wigham and all the others. We wouldn't have had them because it was only because the Quakers believed in egalitarianism and women being able to speak that happened. So I think Quaker women need something. The co-op and the Co-op Women's Guild, I mean, that did an enormous amount for raising women's confidence. For the first time, they would belong to a society where they could become a secretary, they could become an events organiser, they could become chair. They had national conventions, so women who'd left school at 12 years old could stand up and talk to a hall of 500 women at a national convention. I mean, that empowerment that the Scottish Cooperative Women's Guild did for women, and there's still co-op buildings, so that should go on a co-op building. So rather than, my plea would be for these groups of women, or sites where a group activity has happened rather than just a famous individual who was privileged and educated.
That seems a good moment to stop, because